Hi guys, welcome back. This is the second part of the lecture on women writers in the early modern period. I'm Paulette Alatriste, former student of Dr. Lopez, and I am excited to continue our talk on this fascinating subject. So let's get started. We last left off with the case study of Josefa Amari Borbon, a proto-feminist writer of the 18th century in Enlightenment Spain. As you may remember, we looked at two essays written by Amari Borbon, defending women's intellectual capabilities and insisting that women be granted an equal education as well as equal access to Spain's intellectual societies. Her essays, especially the Manual on Women's Education, directly answer the early modern question known as the querelle des femmes, or the woman question. Now, I label Amari Borbon a proto-feminist because she's not a feminist in the modern sense of the word. And we should not view Borbon through that modern lens with our own values and ideas. The same goes for all women writers of the early modern period. We should seek instead to recognize their ideas as they were understood back then. Amari Borbon serves as a case in point. She was an example of the types of women writers that present themselves throughout the 18th century. But this does not mean that female advocates were the only types of writer and that manuals for women's education were the only things published. In this second lecture, we will look at various other authors, although without extended case studies like what we did with Borbon. We are also going to look at the different types of works produced by women and their purpose. Okay, so we know that the 18th century saw a dramatic increase in the number of published authors, women included. And it was so much so that the English writer Samuel Johnson declared that he lived in, quote, the age of authors. A lot of people were writing, okay. The 18th century was not only the age of authors because of the amount of people who published works, however. This is the time where the modern idea of the author emerges. For the first time, writers come to view their craft as a full-time profession. This is also the time where you see a growing literary market encourage large numbers of authors, including women, to make a living from their works, independently from private patrons. Essentially, this is where the notion of authorship as ownership emerges. And what I mean by this is that authors now considered the works they published as their own, like a copyright. Now, things that they wrote could not be published without their consent. Also, the rise of newspapers and periodicals, the growing number of authors, and the fact that people actually paid to read something someone published, we see that authors acquired a new social and political identity. Authors were seen in a new light, and writing for money lost some of the stigma that was once attached to it. So what do I mean by the stigma? We must remember that people prior to the 18th century had different opinions of who were those ideal authors. Because there was still a notion that the best authors were gentlemen amateurs, the idea of having one's name attached publicly to a book or an essay, especially if it wasn't an intellectual one per se, would not have been seen as optimal. So outwardly, the gentlemanly writer or poet should disdain, look down upon the idea of writing for money. And women writers faced this stigma and more intensely. There was a widespread prejudice, a belief that a woman with literary aspirations jeopardized her femininity, her marriage, her family, all by entering the domain of letters. And, well, essentially it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, right? Because even if you were affluent, bourgeois, or aristocratic, women who received a relatively extensive education, they still risked social disapproval by becoming accomplished authors. If you're married, then that woman who aspired to enter the world of letters was bound to neglect her domestic duties. And if she is unmarried, well, then she violated the conventional notions of feminine modesty. But even with all of this happening, women still chose to write, and in large numbers too. They just had to find a way to do so. And this helps explain why so many writers up until the early 18th century preferred to publish their works anonymously or with the use of pseudonyms. A lot of women writers, they use pseudonyms. So, for example, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte, I can't remember if it's Bronte or Bronte. We're going to go with Bronte. But they wrote under the pseudonym of Currer, the pseudonym of Ellis, or Acton Bell. And they did this at the start of their publishing careers in answer to criticism from notable poets. These guys from their time, they said that literature was a man's business and it was not an appropriate occupation for noble ladies. Still, the three sisters published a book of poetry together in 1846, and each published their own novels, such as Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey. And they did it to great acclaim. So, you go, ladies. Anyway, and if you think that this doesn't happen anymore, maybe pseudonyms are a thing of the past. No, it still happens. In fact, one of the most famous children's series today, Harry Potter, okay, was written by J.K. Rowling. But originally, she was going to publish it under her real name, or her full name, Joanne Rowling. Instead, she switched because the publishing house told her that boys did not read novels written by women. She still uses pseudonyms, by the way. She has a murder mystery book series, and she uses the pseudonym of Robert Galbraith. I hope I said that correctly. Yeah, Robert Galbraith. So, pseudonyms for women still happen. Anyway, back to the 18th century, back to the early modern. We talked about authorship, we talked about ownership, and we talked about identity. But now I want to discuss topics. There were different types of published works, such as essays, histories, scholarship, philosophy, political pamphlets, among others. And these were most often published by men writers, since they were viewed as masculine subjects. There were some feminine topics. These were more suitable for the feminine mind, and they included things like translation, memoirs, familiar letters, and travel narratives. And if you remember, Amari Borbón, she started out by translating philosophical essays. So those were things that were seen as appropriate for the ladies. Leave the philosophy, the scholarship, the histories, leave that to the menfolk. Just stick to these things, right? But yet, given the stigma around authorship, the norms women were expected to follow, why did they still go through with it? Well, the rise of genres enjoying a large female readership played a decisive role. Also, writing could provide a middle-class woman with an income that, threatened her respectability far less than a job like manual labor or acting. Just in case you guys didn't know, acting back then was akin to prostitution. So yes, writing, still a better occupation than acting. Still, I don't want you guys to think that all men were horrible to female writers and that they wanted them barefoot and in the kitchen. There were notable instances where women were encouraged to write by male mentors. And one of these writers included the English novelist Frances or Fanny Burney. Also, Amari Borbón's husband seems to have supported her literary endeavors. And about Frances Burney, we'll come back to her toward the end of the lecture. Anyway, with or without men's encouragement and support, women wrote for various reasons. Apart from writing to earn a living, women wrote to commemorate, for pressing political reasons, to create a narrative of one's own, to improve morally, not just yourself, but others, and also to improve the status of women. And those last two reasons I mentioned seem to be ways in which female authors legitimated their entry into the literary marketplace. Let's call it moral didacticism, okay? Literature at this time should encourage virtue and expose vice. And this was a common theme during the Enlightenment. This is also where Mary Wollstonecraft, this is where her writings may lie. They straddle this line, okay? So she has an essay, Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, and that was a cry for the equality of women, including the very taboo subject of sex education and female pleasure. But her most more famous essay, Vindication on the Rights of Woman, is both demanding and subdued, as she brings the tradition of moral advice writing in conjunction with advocating for women's rights. But some women writers, I'm not saying necessarily Mary Wollstonecraft, but some women writers at the time seem to have bent over backward with their moral writings, just in case there was any doubt about their virtue, right? They especially if they're writing with their own name published, they don't want people to doubt their personal virtue. Or perhaps, like I like to think, Amari Borbón, perhaps she wrote like this more to appease those conservative readers. Anyway, okay, so now I want to talk to you about what is arguably the biggest literary development of the 18th century. And this is the novel. Up until now, most, and I say most with an asterisk, most writing was nonfiction. We were supposed to imitate the ancients with writings on philosophy, etc. But by the 18th century, the audience for fiction had increased, and this is where the novel takes hold. And this is where women really, really shine. Women are quickly drawn to the world of novels, and they were both the readers and the writers. Why? It's because novel provided documentation for women's own domestic lives, for their family life, for the threats, for the courtship plot, life as it was lived within the economic and the social context, and how that might differ between a man and a woman, whether you are rich and aristocratic or poor. All of those themes we associate with modern sensibility, right? And so with women as the subjects and as heroines, ideas we have on morality, on nature, on modesty and propriety and domesticity, well, these are fleshed out in the novel. And these are all themes that tend to come up in novels such as those written by Jane Austen. And perhaps you've heard, I think everybody has heard of her most famous novel, which is perhaps Pride and Prejudice. And if you haven't, read the book, then maybe you've seen the Colin Firth series. I don't know. Look it up, enjoy it, have fun. Okay, but Jane Austen is not the only novelist. In fact, if we go back to 1640, a woman by the name of Aphra Behn, I hope I'm saying her name right, is often credited with being the first female writing to earn a living by writing. And she wrote several novels, including her most famous piece, which was titled The Royal Slave, about an African prince who, as you can guess, becomes a slave. Anyway, after that, you also have Frances or Fanny Burney. And Fanny Burney's probably one of the most famous novelists of the 18th century. She was born in 1752, and she was immensely popular. And this, however, even though her family disapproved of her literary career, she published several novels, including Evelina, Cecilia, and Camilla. Her novels tended to be named after the central character, the heroine. What all these novels have in common are these heroines at the center, the courtship rituals, and of course the role of women in relation to the British aristocracy in this case. So, yeah, that is the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about novels and learning about all of the different aspects of women writers in the early modern period. Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you all today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the semester. Have a wonderful day.